we're going to finish up our lecture on study design by tackling case control studies. This is the hardest design to do well, and so I've left it for last. What we're going to talk about is when they're a good choice and what the structure is of them in terms of how we group people and what time looks like in these designs, and then talk about some fundamental principles that are really important to consider when you choose this particular study design. So when do we do them? Well, you won't be surprised to hear me say that we do them when our question is well suited to them. So it really depends on what your question is. But say you do have a question that fits the guidance and the criteria for a case control study. We will pull it out of our toolbox. We'll make sure that it's the right design based on the level of evidence, where gaps in knowledge are, and what the most rigorous design is that we can do for the particular question that we have. So what is it? What is a case control study? It's the study of persons with the outcome and a suitable control group of persons without the outcome. So what this means practically is it means that we would study a group of children born with an orofacial cleft and include a group of individuals that were not born with an orofacial cleft, and they would be our controls. It's very simple, actually, theoretically. It's the devil's in the details with this one. So when do we do them? When is it our study design of choice? And it is largely revolves around how common our outcome is. So when our outcome is rare, when it's less than 10%, it's a good time to consider this particular design. And in the case of orofacial clefting, our outcomes or oral cancer, these are rare outcomes. They affect less than 10% of the population. And so it's very difficult actually to do cohort studies when you have a rare outcome. And so we often choose this study design. It's the next most rigorous approach, and it's the best choice if we have a rare outcome. So just to illustrate, if we wanted to do a prospective cohort study in the United States of orofacial clefting, we would have to follow 700 births in order, 70,000 births to identify 100 children who were born with an oral cleft. And that's just not feasible. And so we sometimes, if we have the data, could do a retrospective cohort study, but it's more often that we don't even have the data that we need. And so what we need to do is actually a case control study. We need to be able to choose a group of people who didn't have the outcome of interest and be able to select them purposefully. And if we're able to do this, case control studies can be magical. They really have a strong ability to determine associations, and they're very efficient. We don't need to study as many people, and so they end up being less expensive and statistically efficient as well. So there's a lot of strengths for this design if you're studying a rare condition. They do get a bad rap. So some people are very cynical or suspect of case control studies. And I guess to them, I would say that, well, sometimes it's the only choice we have. And so it's the best study design that we're able to do. And we can make inference. And there have been examples of us changing policy and changing the way we care for people based on case control studies. This is probably the most classic example, which is smoking. So we determined that smoking causes cancer in the 50s using a case control study design. And we have since had massive campaigns that are global to reduce smoking to prevent cancer that have been very successful. There's some more recent examples as well. And so it's just important to keep in mind that it's a very powerful tool that, if not wielded well, can give case control studies a bad rap, but they can be done very well. So what do they look like structurally? What we end up doing is we have our case group, those with our outcome of interest, and we typically will gather all of them together in some sort of defined population. So say I wanted to study children born with an orofacial cleft, I might use the state of Washington. And over a 3-year period, collect every child that was born with an orofacial cleft in the state of Washington. So you want some sort of defined population. And then you want to get a group of controls or individuals who did not have that outcome. And we want to get a sample. So we're not going to take everybody because the number of live births in Washington state over the last 3 years is way, way more than we need. And we just need a sample of them. So maybe we get 1 to 4 controls for every case that we have. So, and then we compare them. And from these comparisons, we estimate associations. So time and study design, just to kind of orient you to where case control studies lie. We have our RCTs and our cohorts that are prospective, where we start today, we put people into groups and we follow them over time. We have our retrospective cohort where everything has happened in the past, but we know for a fact that the exposure came before the outcome, and we're classifying people based on whether or not they had some exposure. And then in our cross-sectional design, we have our disease and exposure that we're measuring at the exact same point in time as a cross-section. So the unique thing about a case control study is that they look back in time. So we start today and we identify people with our condition or outcome of interest. And then when we get them into our study, we ask them about their past, their prior exposures, and their prior experiences. And we try and then estimate associations based on doing this. So this is what a case control study design looks like. So we start with today, which is on my right as you look at the slides and yours, with the study population. So today we're going to identify individuals and screen people and enroll them into our study on the basis of whether or not they had our outcome, say orofacial clefting, or whether they were a sample of individuals who did not have an orofacial cleft. And then we're going to ask them and collect data that is even before that outcome occurred about their exposures. So, if we're looking at the etiology of orofacial clefting, we might be looking at the maternal exposures during the etiologic relevant time period. So early in the first trimester of pregnancy is when we want to ask about different types of maybe environmental exposures or chemical exposures, nutritional exposures, and then other exposures as well, like genes, which don't vary over time. But anyway, this is basically the design. We're looking back to identify disease as well as looking further back then to look at an exposure. And one thing I often see that I just want to make sure that you come away knowing this is that case control studies, by definition, are always retrospective. There is no such thing as a prospective case control study. So this is the exact same graph that I showed you on the last slide. The difference is that, and there are study designs that are case control studies where they identify cases in calendar time in the future. So it sounds a little confusing, but say today we started our case control study and we were looking at oral cancer. And so we want to identify people with oral cancer, which is relatively rare. So we have in Seattle, we have this thing called the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, which is it serves a 5-state region. We see a lot of cancer cases there. It's a good place to identify individuals who have cancer. We also have a registry, so every individual in Washington state diagnosed with cancer is in this registry. So we can identify all the cases of oral cancer in Washington state. And so we decide that we're going to study this, and we're going to do it for the next 3 years, so from 2020 to 2023. And so when we start now and we identify people get referred into our study from the registry, from the cancer center, and then we enroll a case, and then we enroll a control. And then 2 months later, we enroll a case and we enroll a control. And 3 months later, we enroll 2 cases and control, and so on. We do this for the next 3 years. So people think that's prospective. The issue is that from a design standpoint in study design, it's not. And why is it not? Because the disease, by the time they get into your study, the disease has already occurred. You already have had the disease. And so every case control study is a retrospective study. And if they're collecting data in the future, it's no longer a case control study. So just keep that in mind. I think it's a really confusing kind of topic because there's a calendar time, but there's also the time that the disease occurred and relative to when you're putting people in your study. So ask me questions if this isn't clear. Okay, fundamental points. Key designs. Selection of controls. This actually can be very difficult to get right. And so you have to be incredibly thoughtful and careful about how you decide what the control group is, how they're identified, and if they represent the whole state of Washington of people who don't have the disease. So this is an area where it's really good to consult somebody who knows a lot about study design methodology in terms of how you identify your controls. The other issue with cases is that because cases are rare, sometimes what you want is incident cases. So you want cases that are just diagnosed. You want new cases of disease, which is incidents. But what often happens is you can't get enough cases because the disease is rare and because you didn't have enough sites and because for all sorts of reasons. And so it's very tempting to get prevalent cases. And sometimes that's our only option, is that we have cases that may have been diagnosed, 6 months ago, 2 years ago. And so it's less ideal for a variety of reasons. So it's important to think, like, can I get all the new cases? Is there a way to get the new cases? One thing you can do to increase the statistical efficiency that you've probably seen in research studies is increase the number of individuals that don't have the outcome. And that's actually multiple controls per case. So when cases are rare or the controls are inexpensive, you can get 2 to 3, even 4 controls per case. And what this does is it maximizes your power, or it maximizes your ability to detect an association if one exists. So multiple controls per case is a really nice design option to consider. The other thing we sometimes do is we match our cases to our controls on certain factors. And just the only thing I'll say about that is you don't want to match on anything that you want to study, because if you match on it, you cannot study it. So if you think infant gender is somehow associated with oral clefting, don't match on gender, whatever you do, because once you match on it, it's over. So you have to be very careful about considering how you're going to match, if at all, and if it's really necessary. So selection bias. So this just delves a little bit into more detail around how we choose our cases and controls. The issue is that we're selecting them in a way that biases the actual relationship. So this can happen if we only select those who survive. So these are prevalent cases. And if we only study individuals at one single site, because some sites may see a more complex set of cases than another site. So you have to be really careful about what you're saying about your study population and how you're selecting people. Similarly with control selection, if you choose something that's really easy, like, I'm just going to choose an individual who's hospitalized, they may not be representative of a healthy population. And so even though they don't have the disease that you're studying, the way in which you select them can also lead to selection bias, which leads to your measure of association not being correct. And this is where it makes this design very tricky and difficult. There's also high potential for measurement bias because we're measuring the exposure after the disease occurred. We may not have information that we would like. The measure today or at the time that they enroll in your study may not be the same as the time that they got the disease. So things that change are things like weight, blood pressure, diabetes status. And so that makes the temporality of did the exposure actually precede the disease less clear. And that's also a limitation. If you have a measure that does not vary over time, like some sort of gene, then this isn't a problem. It's not a limitation of this particular design. Here are some strengths and limitations. I think I've talked about most of these as I've lectured, so I'll let you go ahead and read these. I don't have a lot to add other than these are really important limitations that can mean the difference between a well done, properly executed study that gives you a correct answer and one that's not. So buyer beware. Case control studies are hard to do well. They're very easy to do poorly. And I would suggest that if you want to do this design, find a colleague who knows something about study design and work through the selection bias issues and the measurement issues that you'll face with this design. So I've included an example, and that's all I have for this particular study design lecture.